I spent 3 months in 2022 listening to a $17 subliminal confidence tape every single night while I slept. The guy on it, a British man who called himself Aaron, whispered affirmations over ocean sounds. Things like, I attract wealth effortlessly, and I am the calm in the storm. I did it because a podcast told me the subconscious gets rewired overnight if the message repeats enough times. I didn't get more confident. I got a weird crush on Aaron's voice. And then I stopped because I read one thing I couldn't unsee. In 1957, a doctor in Montreal tried to do the exact same thing to his patients. His tapes didn't say, I am worthy. They said whatever the Central Intelligence Agency wanted, and his patients didn't wake up refreshed. A lot of them didn't wake up at all. The doctor was Donald Ewen Cameron, Scottish by birth, president of the American Psychiatric Association. At various points in his career, he was also president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, the World Psychiatric Association, and the Society of Biological Psychiatry. This was not a crank in a basement. This was the most credentialed psychiatrist on the North American continent, and there is a detail about him that most documentaries bury under the other things he did, so I want to surface it first. In November of 1945, Cameron was flown to Germany. The Allies had just captured the surviving leadership of the Third Reich, and they needed psychiatric evaluators for the Nuremberg trials. On the 15th and 19th of November, Cameron sat in a cell in the Nuremberg military prison across from a man named Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler's former deputy. Cameron was one of the psychiatrists tasked with deciding whether Hess was mentally competent to stand trial for war crimes. He signed off on a diagnosis of amnesia and hysteria. Hess was later found to have faked the whole thing. This is the man, the one who had sat across from Nazi war criminals and helped write the book on psychiatric ethics for a post-Holocaust world, who 12 years later began using unconscious Canadian women as experimental subjects for the American intelligence services. The irony is not subtle. The Nuremberg Code, the document written in direct response to what Nazi doctors did to prisoners, was published in 1947. Its first principle is that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Cameron had read it, he had helped create the conditions for it, and he ignored it. Cameron ran his experiments out of a building called the Allan Memorial Institute, part of McGill University in Montreal. From 1957 to 1964, he was funded through a front group called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. They paid him roughly $60,000 over those years, about $500,000 in today's money. The checks were cut by the Central Intelligence Agency. Cameron, according to internal agency documents, did not know where the money was coming from. He thought he was being funded by a humanitarian non-profit. A man was destroying minds on behalf of American intelligence, and he believed the work was being paid for by private donors interested in human dignity. You cannot invent this. He called his method depatterning. The idea was that the human mind could be fully wiped like a hard drive. Once wiped, the patient could then be rebuilt from scratch using the second technique he invented, psychic driving. That involved putting the patient into a drug-induced coma for weeks at a time and playing tape recordings on loop beside their hospital bed. Sometimes the tape said things like, "You are my daughter and I love you." Sometimes they played back things the patient had said during previous therapy sessions. The electroshock dosage was somewhere between 20 and 40 times the clinical standard. The drug-induced sleep often ran 8 to 10 weeks continuous. The pharmaceutical cocktail included LSD, barbiturates, sodium amytal, and thorazine. The patients who walked into the Allan were not spies. They were women, mostly housewives. A lot of postpartum depression, a lot of anxiety. Velma Orlikow checked in 1957 because she was tired and restless after having a baby. Her husband David was a sitting member of the Canadian Parliament. She expected talk therapy. Instead, Cameron injected her with LSD and made her lie there while a tape of his own voice repeated the same sentences over her on loop for hours. He told her she was being healed. Linda MacDonald was 25 when she was admitted, just after giving birth to her 5th child, exhausted and depressed. Cameron put her into a drug-induced sleep for 86 days. When she woke up, her own parents were strangers. Her children's names were gone. She had forgotten how to use a fork. A 25-year-old woman with the motor skills and memory of an infant, Jean Steele, went in for a nervous breakdown. When she came out, she could not remember her marriage. A factory worker named Mary Morrow went in for fatigue. She came out unable to read or write. The pattern was always the same. Women walked into an elite teaching hospital run by McGill University, were told they were going to feel better, and came out without their lives. This fits the technical definition of dark psychology, except dark psychology usually describes what a manipulative partner does to his girlfriend. What Cameron did was industrial. He wrote the manuals. He wrote the tape scripts. He gave lectures about the technique, the whole methodology. What we would now file under cognitive manipulation and behavioral control was published in peer-reviewed journals while it was happening. The nurses knew. The hospital board knew. When patients began to get disoriented and started to believe their nurses were their mothers, Cameron logged that as progress. The paperwork was immaculate. Stop for a second. Forget the declassified documents. You probably picture MKUltra as a story about spies. It isn't. It is a story about a government running behavioral control experiments on citizens who came in for help with their nerves. The real file, declassified in 1977 after a Freedom of Information lawsuit, lists around 149 separate subprojects. Cameron's work in Montreal was Subproject 68. The man running the whole program from Langley was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb had a clubfoot and a small goat farm in Virginia. He was a vegan, a practicing Buddhist, and by his own later testimony, the man who personally authorized every LSD experiment the agency ever ran. On the 18th of November, 1953, Gottlieb invited a group of Army biochemists to a cabin in rural Maryland for a weekend retreat. One of them was Frank Olson, a bacteriologist at Fort Detrick. At dinner on the first night, Gottlieb spiked a bottle of Cointreau with LSD and watched the scientists drink it. When the drug took effect, he told them what he had done. Olson did not take it well. He went home that weekend agitated, paranoid, barely sleeping. By the following Wednesday, the agency had flown him to New York to be quote treated end quote by a psychiatrist on their payroll. 10 days after the cabin, in the early hours of the 28th of November, Frank Olson went out the window of room 1018A at the Hotel Statler. He fell 13 stories onto the 7th Avenue sidewalk. The agency called it a suicide. It stayed a suicide for 40 years. In 1994, Olson's son Eric had his father's body exhumed. The forensic pathologist found a blunt force injury to the skull above the left eye that could not have been caused by a fall. The injury was consistent with someone being struck unconscious before going through the window. The New York Medical Examiner reclassified the death as a homicide. The Olson family has been suing the federal government ever since. Gottlieb's portfolio did not stop at Olson. It included something called Operation Midnight Climax. That was a set of agency safe houses run out of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. One was at 225 Chestnut Street in San Francisco. Another was in Mill Valley. A third was in New York. The agency hired sex workers, paid them $100 a night, and had them lure men off the street back to these apartments. The men were dosed with LSD in their drinks. Agents watched through one-way mirrors while taking notes. This was supposed to be research into whether LSD could work as a truth serum. It mostly produced a decade of American men who walked out of a San Francisco apartment in 1955 and spent the rest of their lives convinced they had had a psychotic break for no reason. If you want a working definition of gaslighting at a federal level, that is it. The targets did not even know there were targets on them. Some of them are still alive. Most of them will die never knowing. By 1973, enough of the program had leaked that the new agency director Richard Helms panicked. He ordered every MKUltra file destroyed. The shredding ran for weeks. They burned the operational records, the photographs, the interview tapes. The only reason any of this is public is that a clerk in the Financial Records Division missed a box. About 20,000 pages of budget paperwork survived the purge. Not the experiments themselves, just the accounting. The church committee found the box in 1975 and subpoenaed what was left. By then, Cameron had been dead for 8 years. He had never been charged with anything. He had never been sued. He had not even been professionally censured. He died of a heart attack in 1967 while mountain climbing in the Adirondacks at 65 years old. Still a working psychiatrist, still the sitting president of the World Psychiatric Association. His obituaries were glowing. Velma Orlikow's husband David, the member of parliament, never let it go. He filed a lawsuit on behalf of Velma and 8 other patients in 1980. The case was called Orlikow versus the United States. It took a decade. In 1988, the agency settled for $750,000 total, split 9 ways. Velma's share, after legal fees, was about $67,000, roughly the same amount adjusted for inflation that Cameron had originally been paid to destroy her. The Canadian government paid out again in 1992, $100,000 per survivor, but only to patients who had been fully depatterned, an extremely narrow definition that excluded most of the class. Most of the survivors did not live long enough to collect. A class action is still ongoing in the Quebec Superior Court as of this recording. Last time I checked, the plaintiffs were the children and grandchildren of the women who went in for postpartum depression and came out not knowing how to count. The trauma, it turns out, is heritable. You can wipe a mother, and the next generation still inherits the whole. Which brings me back to Aaron and his confidence tape. What I was doing for $17 on a phone app is not what the agency did to Velma Orlikow in a locked hospital room with a syringe of LSD. It isn't close, but the underlying idea that if you say something over a person long enough, while their defenses are down, they will become whatever you wanted them to be. That idea was not invented by self-help podcasters. It was tested on people who could not leave. It was funded by a government that later burned the evidence. And the only reason any of us can hear about it now is that one clerk somewhere in a storage room at Langley failed to burn a box of receipts on time.